Great. So welcome to Beth Lida's official Hanukkah class. This is the culmination of some seeds that we already were planting when in our pre-Hanukkah class about Yosef and Parshas Vayeshev, which I will belatedly post online. Sorry about that. But there we started looking at the theme of namely of the dyad of darkness and light, looking at the placement of Joseph tucked within the earth, in the number of holes in which he is thrown into, as the correct figure with which we start the holiday of Hanukkah, in which we are always, in which the light is specifically found within the darkness. So that's where the disclosure occurs. Today we're going to look at that theme more directly, not just through the Parsha. And we're going to look at primarily the laws of, we'll start by looking at the laws of when you're supposed to light the candles. And then we'll move on to an analysis of a Possuk, which has been famously baffling. And then finally, we'll look at a really beautiful Hasidic teaching, which will close it out nicely. So let's share that screen, and we can get rocking and rolling. There we go. Also, if anyone wants to do some chazara for Hanukkah, we can go back also to last year's Hanukkah class, which explored a similar theme, looking at specifically the law around placing the Hanukkah within the 10 handsbreadths, which we talked about last week as well. But this year's class, I didn't want to just do a repeat. I wanted to look at something a little bit different and look specifically at this dyad, this paired and entwined relationship between darkness and light. So let's start. This class is called Light and/in the Darkness, Hanukkah and the Imperative to Hope. So let's start with a little halucha. I love to. Let's start with some law. So what's the time for lighting candles? That's the question at hand. It says, Ein madlikin ner Hanukkah kaidem shetishka chama, ela im sof shkiyasa. Says you cannot light the Hanukkah candles before the sun has fully set. Rather, you light them with the full, like the completion, the culmination of the sun's setting. Now, just quick question. The Rambam says, and actually the Shulchan Aruch quotes this too, actually you're not supposed to delay and you're not supposed to do it before, you're not supposed to do it after. So why did I just light just now? We'll look at that in a minute. But what is different with Hanukkah vis-a-vis other candles that we light in Jewish practice?
We have to
You're lighting them before sunset.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're lighting them after sunset. Shabbos candles you light, and Yontif candles you can light after if you already have a flame, but Shabbos candles you light before sunset.
That's right. Okay, good. So yeah, the first day of Yontif and all Shabbos, especially with Shabbos, you're not allowed to light a candle, right, when it's actually Shabbos. So you don't light the candle when it's dark. So practically we know that has to do with, making sure that you have enough light for the evening. I actually have a theory that maybe the Jews invented the nightlife because in the pre-modern world, you went to bed when the sun went down. But Shabbos and Yontif, you specifically made sure to light a lamp so that you could hang out and have a party at night. But with Hanukkah, unlike the notion of Tosefes Shabbos, right, in which you're supposed to add a little bit of extra weekday to Shabbos, the 18 minutes, if not more, you can go all the way to Plag Mincha. You can light Shabbos candles. But with Hanukkah, you cannot add to it because you need to be lighting them when it's fully dark. That's the key. It needs to be fully dark. It tends to, in halacha, it tends to be identified with, most people say it's with Seisa Kochavim, a similar time as when fasts end. Right? Fast ends around the same time you can start lighting Shabbos candles. So get ready for Asara V'Teves.
What do we do on Friday on Shabbat?
Great question. So, okay, quick practical excursus. On Friday, and not only that, you'll see this in the newsletter too. You make sure to light Hanukkah candles before you light Shabbos candles, because once you light Shabbos candles, it's Shabbos. You light them before, and you light big ones, like usually actually like you like Shabbos-sized candles, so that it burns the requisite amount of time once the sun has actually gone down. Now you don't need to wait for all the way for the for tseis. You just need to make sure it's after shkia, like it says here. So you need to make sure to light big candles so that it burns the requisite amount of time, once the sun actually goes down. So they have to burn for around 48 minutes, something like that. So it's a late one too. It's like the second to last night or third to last night. So it's gonna be a very bright menorah. Okay, so it keeps on going in the next halacha. It says, "Umiyu hane mile lechatchila," and this is all in the ideal circumstance. You light it just after the sun goes down. That's when you're supposed to do it. Aval im avar zehazman, but if time has gone by, velo hidlik, and you haven't lit yet, madlik v'hoylech kol halayla, then you can actually light the entire night. You have the whole night to light the candles. V'im avar kol halayla, but if the night has passed, velo hidlik, and you did not light, ein lo l'tashlumin. You can't make up for it. There's no way to make up for it. So bottom line, this is what's called the difference between lechatchila and b'diavad. Lechatchila, you're supposed to light after the sun has gone down, right there. B'diavad, in a non-ideal circumstance, when real life, when the rubber hits the road, you can light and fulfill the commandment until the end of the nighttime. So the Magen Avraham, who's a classical commentator on the Shulchan Aruch, says that in the Beis Yosef, there's a question of not whether you can light, but what's the question you can imagine? Okay, fine, you can light all night, but maybe what? The difference between the ideal, right, and the non-ideal. Okay, ideally, you can light, and that's all hunky-dory. But in the non-ideal circumstance, fine, you can light, but what? You can light, fine, but maybe you can't say the blessing. Right? Okay, fine. You're allowed to do the action, but maybe you have to recognize it's not being done in the ideal circumstance. So you're not allowed to say the blessing. Maybe the blessing is only when you're supposed to light the candles, but for the rest of the night you can make up for it in a sense, but you can't actually do the full thing with the blessing. Okay, so it says, so you think maybe that you can't say the blessing, but from the language of the Shulchan Aruch, it seems like there's no reason to suspect you can't. Like you should be able to say you should be able to light and say the blessing. But here comes the Rashal Shlomo Luria, 16th century Polish rabbi, who says, "Kasav davka ad chatzos." He said, "Fine, yes you can, but only until midnight. Can you light and say the blessing? After midnight, yes, you can light, but you can't say the blessing anymore." Why is that, you think? Just take a stab at it. There's no answer. What do you think?
It's the next day?
It's not the next day yet, halachically.
Okay.
But I think you're intuiting what he's getting at, though.
Maybe publicizing the miracle so that, but theoretically, you could be living in Manhattan and, you could light at 3 o'clock in the morning and there'll be people going by.
But, you're like the Hagahos Maimonios, because that's exactly what they say. They say, Hagahos Maimonios, because of Kolzman Shebinei Abayis Neurim. So sorry, that's not what they say. That's what someone else says. Where is that? Yeah, I forget who, but someone else says, as long as people are out and about in the streets,
right?
That's the point, right? So midnight seems to be, I think is what Susie was getting at. Midnight seems to be like a meaningful demarcation, right? Now, it's not technically the next day, but it seems like something's over, right? Like midnight is a time that we have, and after midnight, it's another period. Lauren has more of an imminent reason for it. Namely, it's not about the top-down calendar, stopwatch time, but rather it's like the time as we understand it in the way that people live. Yeah. What's up?
So is there a particular time late at night that's not so auspicious, that has more potential for the Yetzer Hara to influence?
Oh my. No. So the height of the Sitra Achra of the Yetzer Hara is actually a mincha.
Okay.
Yeah. So don't worry. As the night progresses, there's more and more. It's moving back to light. I guess that's kind of what we're going to be getting at. And the deepest darkness is when it starts moving back to light. Okay, so we have 2 points here. One is that it is on one hand appropriate to light the candle at night. It's necessary to light the candle at night, but it seems like to go too far into it, you lose something important. And the thing that you seem to be losing is what we kind of refer to generally as persume nisa, publicizing the miracle. You need other people to be around in order to publicize the miracle. If you're just doing it in the middle of the night and nobody's awake anymore, right? Everyone's gone to bed. It's like 4 a.m. Then, or 6 a.m. here, geez. It doesn't count. Right? It doesn't count because the point is you're supposed to be doing it with people. But I find the language of the Hagahos Maimonios, because it seems like something's changed, because originally, as we talked about last week, the placement of the Chanukiah was where? It was location, not like the height. Where was it?
It should
Like a
be in a
window or
place where other
door.
people can see.
Right, it's outside. Right, it's originally supposed to be outside, but once you started moving it into your house, then the question is less actually, interestingly, are people walking around, and more actually, are people awake in the house? So that becomes the standard that the Hagos Maimonios uses, says, Kol zman shebnei habayis ne'urim. Anytime the people in the home are awake. Afilu ad amud hashachar, even until dawn, you're allowed to light and bless. Right? So Rashal says you can bless only until midnight as this kind of and then the period's over. But the Hagos Maimonios says you can light and bless until dawn as long as that's when people are awake.
Why is the blessing differentiated from the lighting of the candle?
I think it's a way for the poskim, for the halachic decisors to differentiate between the ideal, the way you should be doing it and the way people kind of make up for it. And the Magen Avraham agrees, and this is the halacha as we receive it. Lahora aval im yeshenim ein levarech aleim. He says, I agree with you that it's until Amud HaShachar, until dawn breaks. But if people are sleeping, then you can't do it anymore. You can't make the blessing. Okay, so the reason I want to bring this in is 2 reasons. So we moved from the scheduling of candle lighting to a more human-centered perspective. That it's not just about the natural occasion of darkness. It is specifically about Hanukkah lights need to be lit in the darkness and when there is activity. So Hanukkah is a time of, I want to say maybe in a way, resisting, right, the supremacism of the darkness, right, resisting the domination of the darkness, because the Hanukkah lighting needs to be both within genuine darkness. You cannot do it early, you can't do it when the sun is starting to rise. And though it needs to be when people are still awake and still alive and still active. That's the conjunction we need for Hanukkah candles. So it's not just in the darkness, it needs to be in the human darkness. It needs to be in the human experience of darkness is light kindled. Not in natural darkness, not in objective darkness, but in subjective darkness. Right? In the darkness as we experience it. That's when we light the candles. Does that kind of qualification make sense? Because if it was just about darkness, then we would light it, you would say the ideal time to light it would be when it's darkest at night. But that's not the answer. The answer is we're supposed to light it when it's dark and when people are around to see it. So on one hand, it's about publicizing the miracle. Fine, that makes sense. But on the other hand, it's about the lighting of Hanukkah candles actualizing, lighting not just the existence of light in darkness, but kindling a light in the darkness. That someone needs to do it, and someone needs to see it. It's the human experience of darkness that Hanukkah candles are lit within. Okay, it's a very important qualification. I think it comes through when they're hashing out when you're allowed to light and when you're allowed to bless. The blessing is the kind of coup de grace of the mitzvah. You can only bless something when someone's there to experience it. The blessing, right, the actualization of the mitzvah has to be when it is dark and people are aware. Yeah.
It sounds like you're saying you're not allowed to light candles by yourself.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, right? Like, let's say you're in the middle of a desert or something. Do you still need to light Hanukkah candles? Um, I don't know if that's actually dealt with. That's interesting. I think the answer still is yes. Because who knows? Who knows who might come by? Who might come by?
I mean,
Maybe coyotes.
what if
But
you
for those of us who
you
live
live on your
alone,
own?
Right, but I mean, you live on your own. Oh, you mean in terms of being awake?
I'm saying if you are the only one who lives in your house or apartment, are you saying as long as there's people in general who live nearby you?
That's a good point. Yeah. So what's interesting is that the Hagos Maimonios has relocated the question of who's around, not to the receivers of the mitzvah, but to the actors of the mitzvah. Right? So it seems like there's not something just about seeing someone light a Hanukkah candle. Seeing a Hanukkah candle in the window. It seems like part of the point is, are there people around to experience the lighting with you? Right? It's not just seeing the light, it's actually kindling the light that's important. Now, I live on my own, but I would say that the way I would translate this standard is thinking about what's a reasonable time to be communicating this in the community, right? To be putting the candles to be seen by people, that amidst whom I live. And I was wondering actually if maybe a way to observe, in an apartment building, if it's actually more appropriate to put it in your hallway. I was thinking about this actually. I think it's a lot. I think you'd actually fulfill the mitzvah that way. It's interesting. I think I'd probably get in trouble with my landlord, but still.
I was going to say you'd be in
Fire
big
laws.
trouble for doing
Yeah,
it.
but there's one landlord who is the true landlord, and that's the person, well, the being whose opinion I care most about, the Lord of the Adon HaOlam. So that's the only landlord I care about. This is charity. This is a joke. Do not get mad at me. Olympia Properties Limited. Okay. So let's look at a famous Possuk that is then tweaked and remixed in our liturgy. So the Possuk goes this: Yotzer or uvore choshech, ose shalom uvore ra. Ani Hashem oseh chol eila. All right, God is, I form light and I create darkness. I make peace and I create evil. I am God who does all these. Okay, now what's the bracha we have? Right, bracha Hashem. Yotzer over choshech oseh shalom uvorei es ha kol. Right, creates everything. But the original pasuk is makes peace and creates evil. And what's going on here? So what we have is, how do you relate to this? What is this pasuk trying to say? Why does it use different verbs? What kind of description of God is this? Or self-description of God, right? This is in God's voice.
Okay, it's all valid. Like you can't only have or want light, and you can't only have or want peace. Like it's all part of everything.
Okay. That there's a holism to monotheism. And that holism demand, sorry.
Well, yeah, like we always sort of want like this perfect, like this perfection, like this perfect world where it's always light and sunny and beautiful and happy and peace. But I think there's like that foil concept of, but you don't know what those good things are if you haven't ever experienced the opposite.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, that's actually taken in like a theological, philosophical direction by Saadia Gaon, which we'll look at soon.
And there's also that if there's only one, then you're sort of lacking that free will as well. Like if everything's always good and perfect, then there's no choice.
Yeah, I think you're tapping into a strong tradition in the Jewish literature in Torah to find specifically choice within darkness, but darkness like the space between two things, like dark matter. Okay, So what else? Anyone else? What do you think? Why is God describing God's self this way?
It's similar to what Susie said. It's the omnipotent God.
Mm-hmm.
So God who includes absolutely everything,
Mm-hmm.
good and bad. I mean, it's God gave the creation, and then there's a potential that just keeps unfolding.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that there's a realism there in the sense that this is God created reality, not the ideal. Right? God created the world, and that means a robust accounting of everything within it. And that means both one thing and its opposite. Right? God is nosei hafuchot. God is the mediator of opposites, or the container of opposites. So we have the Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, a medieval commentator on everything, but his commentary is especially famous on the prophets. And he writes, one thing to note, right, is there's a bunch of different verbs used here, right, and these verbs then become kind of the basis also of the Kabbalistic worlds. Beria, Yetzira, and Asiya, right? God forms light, creates darkness, makes peace. And why is there this variation of verbs? Right? Why isn't it God creates light, creates darkness, creates peace? Right? What's going on with this specification of the verbs? So Kimchi says, Uvore creates. This is like a decree, a gezerah. Now, why does he say it? So part of it he's drawing on is there's this notion that yotzer, like in modern Hebrew, is to form something. Like you take clay and you make it into, you take one thing and you turn it into something else. That's formation. Creation is yesh me'ayin, right? Is creating something from nothing. And that's like God saying yehi or, vayehi or. Let there be light, and there was light. Poof, light, right? God did not create light out of something. God created light. Now let's go back to that point, right? First, there's darkness. Then there's light. And God did not create light out of the darkness. God created light novelly, right? Newly. But there had to be darkness first. Darkness had to come first for there to be light created. Uvore choshech. God creates the darkness first, right? Yetzira, Beria. Yetzira is posterior to Beria. Formation, turning one thing into something else, has to come after something is created. Right? You can only take raw materials and turn them into something new once those raw materials are created. So which one is the raw materials and which one is not? The darkness is the raw materials. Borei choshech. God creates darkness first. And we know this, right? We know this because that God has to say that the light, like has to decree the light. But the darkness had to come first. The point, this actually is like gesturing towards a long philosophical and mystical tradition that no has to always come before yes, right? That the dark has to come before light. Evil has to come before good. The shell has to come before the fruit. But here I think the point is that light can only appear out of darkness. Right? Think of it experientially. Imagine turning on a light bulb, a transparent light bulb, in a perfectly white room. Right? You can't see it. Light can only appear from within darkness. Light, as it were, needs darkness. Okay? So that's just something I want us to kind of keep in the back of our minds. All right, but here we have a very interesting natural meaning for this, which I think is a very interesting new ingredient in the mix. He quotes the sages who say, Uvore choshech, what does that mean? God creates the darkness. Haaretz, God created the earth. Why? Because it causes darkness in the world. What does that mean? This is kind of like this anti-materialist kind of thing? No, because when the sun sets, the earth is a barrier between the sun and us, and thus there's darkness. That's correct, right? That the earth gets in between us and the sun. That's why there's, like imagine an eclipse. That's why there's nighttime. The nighttime is when we are turned away from the sun. So, in other words, that darkness is not something other than light. It is rather, what? An experience of light. A human experience of light. Because it's what it means to have light and a world. Darkness is the world getting in the way of light. It is what it means to live on an opaque orb. But more to the point, it's what it means to live in a world. To live in the world is to have that is to always have, you're always hitting up against something. Another person, another perspective, another need, another conflict. What it means to live is to live in a world of opacity. You don't know what other people are thinking. You don't know what other people are feeling. The fact of others, right? It means that there's always something new for light to reveal. Okay, so we have two models now. One is darkness as this primordial first creation, out of which light could spring. Right? Yotzer Or, that God took the darkness away and turned it into light. Another way of looking at it is that they're not two other things, but rather darkness is, an experience of light. Darkness is a necessary experience of light as a human being. Because we would be angels if we would just be bathed in light all the time. But to have light and a world means there's darkness, because the world, quite physically, obstructs the light. But more to the point, to live in a world is to always live in a world that rotates and revolves and oscillates between light and darkness. It's not something other than light. It's rather an experience of light. That's a very interesting reframing of darkness, right? Not as something other than light, but rather as an experience of it. And not just an experience of it, but all seeing requires darkness. Because it always requires opacity. It requires a surface. If we were transparent, if everything were transparent, if your eyeballs were transparent, there would be no sight. The only way we're able to have the manifestation of light is through darkness, through the unseen. Okay, keeps on going. Ufeirush oses shalom, or what does it mean to make peace? Bein hatoldos, and I think by toldos what he means here are the elements. Right? To make peace between these elements. Which elements? I think these four things that he just mentioned. Light, darkness, good, and evil. Which are opposites in their nature. And when they are harmonious, then there's health and there's peace. This is what it means creates evil. Afal lo bara'am l'rai. God didn't create these things for evil, but rather, and this is what Saadia Gaon says, and this I think is what Susie was also vibing on, that if you were to say, okay, the fact that there is good and evil implies then that there is then a God of good and a God of evil, that would be a fundamental misunderstanding. Thus, God says, I am the one who has created who has made all of these. All of these. So what is the Oses Shalom has to actually connect to the Vorei Ra, because true harmony is incorporating the dark. Not just the ideal, like Susie was saying. You can't just pick 'em, choose 'em the way you want it, all the good stuff, and say, great, that's God. But rather, a real account of creation is not good, but harmony. That's peace. Peace is finding the harmony, the balance between all of these things, all of their necessities. Okay. Thoughts, comments? Okay. So here we have a fun midrash in which a number of anti-philosophy midrash that we find in Torah. I mean, here we have a great example of the Hanukkah tradition of Jews defeating Greeks. So take that, philosophers. Here comes the Torah. So Philosophia Echad Sha'alis Rabban Gamliel. So Rabban Gamliel, the prince, right? He's the chief of the patriarchate. He's an ancestor of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, right? He's the Nasi. He's the chief of the Jews in Palestine. He says, he gets into a dialogue, a dispute with the philosopher. The philosopher says, and I think this is actually, again, this is what Susie was intuiting. She says, Sayar Gadol Hu Elokeichem. Your God is, you think your God is such a great Sayar? Same verb as Yatsar, right? Such a great artist, such a great artisan, craftsperson? Ella shematza samemanim tovim shasiyu oso. Your God is only great at creating stuff. Why? Because God had good materials. Right? Any chef will tell you. It's really always about the freshness of the ingredients that makes the dish. What were these materials? Tohu, vohu, choshech, ruach, mayim, usahomos. Right? Chaos, madness, darkness, spirit, or wind, or air, rather, really. Ether, probably. Water, and the depths, right? These are all nouns. These are all nouns that appear in the verse, which God did not apparently create, right? The Spirit of God is hovering over the depths. It does not detail that God created these things, right? That there's the depths, there's the rushing waters, there's tohu vavohu, chaos, right? Formless void. So he seems to be saying, listen, your God's creation is not so hot. Really, there's no Bria, it's just Yetzirah. God had all this great stuff, and God made a great world out of it. That's not such a big deal. Isn't it also, in a way, is like gesturing towards the Aristotelian belief in and the eternity of matter, right? That because of the conservation of matter, creation ex nihilo is impossible. Right, so the philosopher believes that God's creation is demoted because really it was just a refashioning of already existent matter. Okay, so Rabban Gamliel replies, Tipach ruche dahu gavra. Basically, your spirit should blow. I mean, basically, it means that like you should breathe your last breath. Kulon kasiv bahen bria. No. Everything was created. And even though it's not explicit, it's implied. Tov vavohu shne'emar ose shalom uvore ra. Aho. It says in our Possuk in Isaiah, God made peace and created evil. Created evil, that's chaos. That's the void. Choshech, how do we know that God created darkness? Yotzer or uvore choshech. Mayim, halu shmei hashamayim v'hamayim. Lama shetzivav nivrau. Why is it that the heavens and the water are praising God? Because God commanded and they were created. That one you have to tight out a little bit. And air, ether, ki hine yotzer harim uvore ruach, because God has formed the mountains and created the air. Right, the fresh mountain air. Tehomos, the depths, as it says in Mishlei, be'ein tehomos cholalti. When there were no depths, I was created. So in other words, I was created, that's in the voice of wisdom, right? When there were no depths, I was created. And if God created wisdom before depths, then obviously God created the depths too. That's an inferential point. Point is that Breshis Rabbah is insisting what? Breshis Rabbah, I actually should have ordered these differently. Breshis Rabbah is saying that is insisting on the holism of the count of creation. Darkness is not just something that God found and did something with. Darkness is rather something that God made. Okay, that darkness is something that God made. Okay. We have, though, I think, still we have this, I think with the Radak, I think we have kind of the gesturing to this, but I think we still are like struggling with this question of dualism or oppositionalism. Is it darkness versus light, darkness and light, darkness with light, etc.? So I found this really fascinating midrash in Midrash Tanchuma, which is a late-ish 8th century, 9th century Palestinian midrash. It says, I think it kind of gestures towards this holism that I think that the Radak was gesturing to as well. So we'll see. And I think, looking at this focus on kol, right? Ani Hashem osek kol eile. I am God who does all of these. But really, the point is kol, right? Everything. Vayedaber Elokim es kol hadvarim. Right? God spoke all of these words, referring to the Ten Commandments, right? The Aseret Adibros. Hakol bivas echas. God actually said everything at once. God always, in a sense, says everything at once, right? We have this idea, again, shnei hafuchot, two opposites. God speaks twice and I hear once. Sorry, God speaks once and I hear twice, right? That God can say zachor and shamor in the same word. God's speaking is not just the way that we take it, but God's speaking is fractal. It says, Memis umechaye bevas echas. God kills and gives life in one word, in one go. Make virofe bevas echas. God afflicts and heals in one go. Ona isha al hamashber, yorde yamim v'holche midbaros, chavushim beves hasurin, echad b'mizrach v'echad b'marav, echad b'tzafon v'echad b'daram. God answers a woman on the birthing stool. God attends to those who are sailing in the seas and traveling in the desert. God attends to those imprisoned in jail, one in the east and one in the west, one in the north and one in the south. Yotzer or uvore choshech. God forms light and creates darkness. Oses shalom uvore ra. Makes peace and creates evil. Kol eile bivas echas. All of this in one instance. What's this midrash getting at? It's immensely poetic and it's quite beautiful. Its imagery is stunning. I think there are two techniques it's using. One is conceptual and the other one is spatiotemporal. What do I mean? It starts by talking about how God is not just identified with one aspect of what it means to act, but rather an action in its completeness. The action of life has to include death. If God just caused birth, and there was no death, right? Then that would not be sustainable. God's bringing life into existence is also God's bringing death. Take care, Annie. Chag Sameach. And another way of thinking that again is that death is not other than life, but death is rather an aspect of life. That these are two aspects of the same whole. Sickness and healing also. So that's the two, I think, and we go back to that, light and dark, peace and strife. Okay. But then he also has this note, but also there's this temporal bilocality of it, that God is attending to people in different parts of the world, in the east and the west, in the north and the south, it doesn't matter. And that's interesting because, but all of these examples, I think, also push forward this conceptual point too in a more subtle way. God is present and active in what unites these four experiences: childbirth, voyaging in the sea, traveling in the desert, and imprisonment. We return to Joseph. Not an accident. I really don't think that's an accident. So what unites those four experiences?
They're all very challenging.
Mm-hmm.
They're not some, they're I don't know, I lost the right word for it, but they're trying things. They're difficult
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
things.
very much.
And the person's not in total control in any of those instances.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think you're both quite right. All right, they're at the limit of one's agency, one's limit of one's abilities. At some point, you look over the edge and you see the depths, the darkness, right? And whether it's literal, in terms of imagine traveling in a desert, right? There's no lamps around. All you have is the stars. You're in pitch black. Or you're in the middle of the ocean, right? No way to orient yourself. In the middle of the darks, the middle of the depths. You're plunged into a deep pit. You're thrown into the deepest dungeon. Light's been taken away from you. And with the example of a woman in childbirth, the limits of your body's abilities, especially in the pre-modern world, right, in which survival of childbirth was not always, the norm. Or vice versa, actually, or the infant's survival. So here what we have are these, I think, times of faith, these experiences of faith, because it is beyond what you're able to secure for yourself. I think, but to kind of make it less doctrinal, these are experiences in which you touch the darkness, in which you experience the edge of what you can navigate on your own, being aware of something that is utterly beyond, something that you're enmeshed in the middle of.
And I was like very struck by the
Mhm,
timelessness. I don't think it's
mhm,
super relevant to what you're trying to talk about in terms of the Hanukkah class, but
mhm.
that it's like the concept of like, oh, on the first day God created this, and on the second day, like that's all very human experience. It's not like for God there is no time. It's all happening simultaneously.
Right, yeah,
So
no,
and therefore he couldn't make something out of something because it just happened all at once, so to speak.
whoa, huh. That is very interesting. You're right. It is not on topic, but you and which Islamic theological school would have a lot to say to each other? I forget, but I think yeah, it's a very interesting point you're making. Um, okay. So, I mean, here what we have again is gesturing towards God as a God of a holism, right? Not of one versus another, but actually, and not just that, but also God specifically found in the darkness, right? That all those experiences are not like, times of like religious ecstasy or rapture. These are all God is the one who is present, who attends to those in the dark.
Well, and
Uh,
isn't that when you sort of call to God the most, like when you're in distress, when you're struggling?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking in terms of like kind of framing these as experiences of faith. But I think it's a little bit. It's not just. It's not just the experience of. It's not just like a time of faith per se, but rather it's like a time of darkness. It's an experience of darkness. Um, okay. So I have some Zohars, but I think we're going to skip to the Svasemas. It's okay. Yeah, all right. We'll do one. We'll do one. Um, No, I mean the truth is, I think these are kind of just outworkings of what we've seen already. It's okay though. I'll share the source sheet. You can do this in your own time. Because here's this. This is this beautiful Svasemas. This is Svasemas. Rabbi Yehuda Leib Alter was a rabbi in the late 19th century, and he died in I think 1902. I want to say 1901, 1902. He was a Hasidic rabbi in central Poland. His there's a few different kind of like mini worlds in the Hasidic world, and he in Congress Poland was kind of a discrete group. It was coming out of the school of the Chayze of Lublin, the Seer of Lublin, and his disciple the Yehudi Kadosh, or the the Heilige Yid, the Holy Jew, and then his disciple the Prishischa Rebbe, and then student of his was the Kotzker, famously controversial, passionate, uncompromising figure, a person who strove for authenticity at all times. And the Kotzker had a student named the Chidushei Arim, Rabbi Yehuda Yitzchak Meir of Gur, and his son was the Svasemas. So he was kind of the scion of Central Polish Hasidism, and he wrote this beautiful long-form commentary called the Svasemas, the Language of Truth, and in it are really deeply reflective, often very spiritually oriented points. And he also uses the language of light a lot, so that's, I think, relevant as well. So it says, commenting on Hanukkah, and specifically commenting on the strangeness of the lashon, of the language, in the second bracha. The second bracha, as we said a little bit ago, was She'asa nisim lavosenu. God has made miracles for our ancestors. Bayamim ahem, in those days, bazman hazeh, and in this time as well. So why is it that we say in those days and in this time? In those times and this time. What's going on with that? Is it the past or is it the present? Right? Does the miracle exist in those times? And are we remarking about it in this present? Or does the miracle still happen now? Is it still happening now? Okay. So it's Bali Suffolk. It says, there's no doubt that the rabbis felt and perceived that when these times came, it would be impossible to persist in them without the help of this innovated holiday in the midst of the candles, illuminated within the darkness. Okay. So when it says this time, what do you think the Svasemas means by this time? What time is it referring to? Okay, the most kind of direct reading of it is that the time refers to the time of the Hellenists, right? The time of the Hasmoneans, that the rabbis had to enact Hanukkah. I mean, one thing that's really important to know, and this is the reason it's going to be compared to Purim later in this teaching, is that Hanukkah and Purim are rabbinic holidays. They are not biblical. They were instituted by the sages. Hanukkah doesn't even show up in the Mishnah, for goodness sake, right? So it kind of shows up in the Mishnah, not really. We'll see about that in a little bit too. But point being is that Hanukkah is a holiday that was made, not a holiday that we inherited. It wasn't instituted by God. It was made by humans. And why? Because the rabbis perceived that at this time, but interestingly, what's this time? Is it just generally the Hanukkah time? Or is it maybe seasonal? We'll look at that. We'll see that. I think it's ambiguous, and we'll look at it in a minute. It says, to my mind, in the liturgy of the second blessing, it says, "Bayamim ahem bazman hazeh," right? In those days, and in this time, because the miracle occurred in its time, i.e., when it did, according to the order of the generations. Well, what does it mean? The order of the generations there. All the holidays are fun. Can't even wait. Sukkot, Simchas Torah, Yom Kippur. Because the miracle occurs according to the order of the generations, i.e., after everything else. Right? Hanukkah is like the last thing that happened that that is part of our calendar. Right? I guess maybe technically the second destruction of the temple too, but Tisha B'Av was already instituted because of the first temple, so not really. Because then because until Hanukkah, the original holidays were enough. Like all we needed in terms of holiness were the original holidays, right? Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Pesach, Shavuos, etc. That's all even Purim, right? Purim had already been instituted too. All we needed were those holidays. But after the experience of Antiochus, after the experience of the Syrian Greeks, after this experience of like the depths of the darkness, that's when the rabbis realized that we needed Hanukkah. And God saw through them that we needed another. As is written, God does everything in its time. So, God prepared the healing in advance of the wound, and then unleashed the darkness. So we said before that light can only emerge once darkness is there already, but before darkness, it seems what we need is healing. It's healing that's recovered prior to the darkness, not light. I would say hope, which is where we're getting at. The sages of that generation perceived and understood that God had prepared for them a miracle in the year prior in the midst of the candles of redemption. Aho! And that's an important point. When was Hanukkah instituted? The year after. Not just after they defeat. It takes a while for them to actually institute the holiday. If you look at the book of Maccabees, and if you look at chapter 2 of Shabbos.
It's like a lot of things. It's like the 1 year commemoration of like this thing that happened.
Yeah, and it's the 1 year commemoration also of missing Sukkot, right? It's actually interestingly, it's a remarking on the absence of the biblical holiday because the temple wasn't usable, and that's why Hanukkah is 8 days long. So Hanukkah was instituted in this darkness, in this absence, because they understood, looking back, that this new pillar of the calendar had emerged, a new time of holiness that we needed. But I really do think it's not, he's going to say, and it's not just this historical moment, but really it's the cyclical moment. When is the time that we need this extra boost of holiness? Just on the cusp of the dark. That's when we need it. It says, and so as time progressed, we say in those days, referring to the historical period after the Hellenists. But similarly, in each and every year, in this time. So it's both. It's not just historical, it's also present, it's also cyclical. It's every year. Truly, just before the month of Teves. And by the way, what's winter called in the Jewish calendar? Tekufa, in the rabbinic calendar, it's called Tekufa Tatevet. It's Teves that is the kind of the epitome of winter. So just before winter happens, each year we need to illuminate these days, and thus we say in this time. So what's Hanukkah designed to do according to the Svasemas? It's designed to bring light into the darkness. It's the deepest darkness that needs the light. I think in this way what it is a commitment to the holism we saw before. That just as, we would prefer to have light all the time, but we need to acknowledge the darkness. Fine, that's very philosophical. But experientially speaking, we experience the dark. And that's, we're in the middle of the desert. We're in the middle of the ocean. We're in the middle of November. You wake up and it's dark, and you go to bed and it's dark. You go to work and it's dark, and you leave work and it's dark. That's the time we need to bring in the light. To couple the light and the dark. To have them be together. He says, of course, the biblical holidays are of a more lofty nature, fine. But it seems to me that we have the merit to observe these rabbinic holidays fully, since today's pilgrimage holidays lack the temple. How were you originally supposed to observe Sukkot, Pesach, and Shavuos? You go to the temple, you do pilgrimage. That's why it's called a chag, which is a cognate with the word hajj. But now we don't have a temple anymore. All of the biblical holidays are deficient, kivyachol. But Purim, Hanukkah, We observe those perfectly. There's nothing we're lacking when it comes to Purim and Hanukkah. In these days, he said, we can receive the light of the holiday as we stand, without any change or diminishment, as we exist today. In a way, it's because we exist in a world without the temple that we have a holiday like Hanukkah in which we can bring. We need the temple's absence. We need the dark hole, the darkness of the missing temple. We need to bring the light into. That's where the light needs to be brought. It's only in a post-temple, it's only in a deficient world that Hanukkah needs to exist. And this is the hint of the name Hanukkah. Ka, Chanukah, means just like them. Because on this holiday, the Jewish people ascended in holiness, and now today, that same holiness comes to us within a place of darkness. That's where the holiness comes, into the darkness. And thus, the mitzvah is to put the Chanukiah within 10 hands breadths, which we talked about last week and last year.
But Josh, I have a question, but the holiday itself
Mm-hmm.
originated during the time of the temple. So are you saying that it was like foreseeing that would be a time when we would have no temple, and that's why we have it?
Yeah, I think yes. In a way. Why? Because yes, we technically had the temple, but it was taken away from us. That's the experience of Hanukkah, right? I think the kind of triumphalist account of Hanukkah is that we fought and we conquered and we got it back, right? Except that
Yeah,
the miracle,
definitely.
except for the miracle of the oil, which persisted after that, because the temple was ruined, and all of the oil was spoiled, except for one cruise. All right, and that one cruise then lasted for 8 days. So it's only in the ruination of the temple that the miracle occurs. And I think that's anticipating proleptically Hanukkah in a way as the holiday of exile. I mean, when I say exile, I mean the holiday in the depth of the dark. Hanukkah is a holiday in which it's designed to be celebrated where?
In the dark.
But also where? That's when. Where?
Oh, sorry.
Where?
But everywhere, but I mean, including Eretz Yisrael and the Galut.
But
Both.
where? Think less think less, I don't know, nationally. Yes,
think, yeah.
Rivka. Yes, Rivka, at home. At home.
Ah.
Even when no, and here's I think the pushback to the point, like, oh, there was still a temple. Even when there was a temple, where do you light the Chanukiah?
At home.
At home. It was
Yes,
not
yeah.
the menorah of the temple that was ever lit. Now, yeah, it's a very beautiful point that is made by that I taught over the Shabbos, that every Chanukiah it has the holiness of the temple's menorah, but the temple comes home. We don't go to the temple. It's the opposite of a pilgrimage. We download the temple into our home. It's the home holiday. And we observe it just like we did back then, because it was always a home holiday. It was always a holiday of sustainability, a holiday of resilience, because the home is where we are regathering our strength. And I think thus, like, the natural kind of shift to what the Haggadah Maimonides was saying before, that the people at home are awake. It's about the home. It's about what it means to be branching outward again, right? Starting in this core place and then stretching out. This is what it means to flower, to light, kindle a light in the darkness, for it to spark and for it to grow and then to radiate outwards. This, and light never stops, right? It just radiates forever. But at some point, light becomes dark, right? The candle has a certain shape, but light continues forever. We know that, that's how we can see stars. So darkness is part of the light. Right? We look at the innermost flame of the candle. There's the wick, that's the earth, right, which blocks the sun. And also the deepest part of the flame is dark. It starts in dark and it ends in dark. Light and dark come together, exist together. It's the light within the dark that we're talking about. in a way, and this is a beautiful teaching from the Bnei Yissaschar, it says, quoting the Pinchas of Koretz, an early Hasidic master, a student of Baal Shem Tov, he says, and this is incredible, Shebechol Chanukah, b'sha'as hadlakas haneros, every Hanukkah, when you light the candles, misgale haor haganuz, shehu oiro shamelech Mashiach, the light of the Messiah, which is hidden, is not created, but revealed. Revealed from what? From the dark. Messianic light, redemptive light, is not other than the dark. It's the light that is tucked within the dark. And we disclose, we don't bring light in to defeat the darkness. I think that's the way a lot of kind of more like Dead Sea Scrolls type, Kanaim, zealous, dualistic kind of way of thinking about it. Light versus darkness. But that's what we saw before, what Saadia Gaon was saying. That's idolatry. There's one God. There's the God of light and dark. Created both. Peace, harmony between the two. That's the key in Hanukkah, is to find light within the darkness when we need it the most, so we can live, so we can find healing, so we can keep on living. Hanukkah is a holiday of life because it is the detection of and disclosure of the light within the dark, bringing them, not just bringing them together, but revealing how they were actually together all along. So I wish everyone an illuminating Hanukkah, one in which we're able to look within the darkness of the night and bring our light within it, and also look within the darkness of ourselves and find the light that's tucked within. Chag Sameach, everybody.